In the frozen streets of 19th century St. Petersburg, a man existed whose insights would forever alter humanity's understanding of itself. Fyodor Dostoevsky was not merely an author of fiction. He was a cartographer of the human soul who mapped territories that academic philosophers would not discover for generations to come. Decades before Sigmund Freud would propose theories about the hidden dimensions of consciousness, this Russian visionary had already explored the deepest caverns of human psychology. Years before existentialist thinkers would declare the primacy of individual choice, he had dramatized this truth through characters who continue to haunt readers more than a century after their creation. Long before the 20th century witnessed the rise of totalitarian states, he had predicted precisely how such systems would emerge and why millions would willingly submit to them. What awaits you now is a complete exploration of the philosophical universe this genius constructed through his literary works. These novels contain far more than compelling narratives and memorable characters. They hold within them the most penetrating analysis of human nature ever committed to paper. They wrestle with questions that have tormented thinking beings since consciousness first awakened in our species. What gives existence meaning when the universe appears indifferent to our presence? How can individuals remain morally grounded when traditional sources of authority crumble away? Why does humanity persist in choosing paths that lead to destruction even when better alternatives exist clearly before us? Can societies achieve justice without sacrificing the freedom that makes us human? Does suffering serve any purpose, or does it merely demonstrate the cruelty of existence? These inquiries did not emerge from comfortable academic contemplation. Dostoevsky forged his philosophy in the furnace of extreme suffering that would have destroyed lesser minds. Authorities arrested him as a young revolutionary and sentenced him to death before a firing squad. He stood blindfolded in the winter cold, listening to the preparation of rifles that would end his life. At the final moment before execution, a messenger arrived with news that his sentence had been commuted to hard labor in the frozen wasteland of Siberia. He endured 4 years in a brutal prison camp where he witnessed depths of human cruelty and degradation that shattered his youthful idealism. Throughout his adult life, he suffered from epilepsy that brought him to the edge of death repeatedly. He lost children he loved deeply. He struggled with compulsive gambling that destroyed his finances. He knew poverty intimately. This man understood suffering not as an abstract concept, but as lived reality. Yet Dostoevsky possessed more than just experience of hardship. His intellect ranged across philosophy, theology, psychology, and political theory with extraordinary depth and breadth. He engaged seriously with the most advanced thinking of his era and understood where contemporary intellectual movements were leading civilization. He perceived dangers that others could not see because they were still enchanted by promises of progress and rational improvement. He dedicated his remaining years to warning humanity about catastrophes that approached and to pointing toward different paths that might save us from ourselves. The philosophy you are about to encounter does not present itself as a systematic academic theory with carefully defined terms and logical progressions. It emerges through living, breathing characters who feel as authentic as people you have known personally. It dramatizes itself through stories that lodge permanently in your imagination. It speaks through dialogues that capture the rhythms of actual human conversation. This is philosophy born from suffering, refined through genius, and offered as a gift to anyone courageous enough to confront the most difficult truths about human existence. Prepare yourself now for an encounter with one of the most profound minds that has ever examined what it means to be human. This journey will take you through darkness before it offers any glimmer of light. But those who complete this exploration will emerge with vision clarified and understanding deepened in ways that change how they see everything that follows. Freedom occupies the absolute center of Dostoevsky's philosophical vision. This is not freedom as politicians discuss it when they speak of voting rights or constitutional protections. This is not freedom as economists analyze it when they examine market choices. This is freedom as the metaphysical foundation of what separates human beings from every other form of existence in the known universe. It is simultaneously our greatest glory and our deepest curse. To grasp what Dostoevsky means when he speaks of freedom, you must abandon conventional understandings of the term. Most people imagine freedom as the ability to do whatever they wish without external interference. They conceive of it as freedom from obstacles, restrictions, and limitations imposed by other people or circumstances. But Dostoevsky points towards something far more fundamental and far more disturbing. He means the capacity to choose between good and evil, the power to act against your own rational self-interest, the ability to destroy yourself and others for reasons that make no logical sense whatsoever, the freedom to reject happiness, love, meaning, and life itself. This freedom is not optional equipment that human beings may or may not possess. We cannot surrender it even when we desperately wish to escape its burden. Even when we claim that our actions are determined by genetics, upbringing, or social conditioning, we are making a free choice to accept that deterministic explanation. Even when we submit ourselves to authority figures or ideological systems that promise to make decisions for us, we are freely choosing to submit. Freedom haunts every moment of human existence. It lurks behind every decision, regardless of how trivial or automatic that decision might appear. We are condemned to be free, and this condemnation generates the anxiety, guilt, and existential terror that characterize human consciousness. Why would existence curse us with such a frightening responsibility? Because without freedom, goodness becomes meaningless. A machine programmed to perform helpful actions deserves no moral praise. An animal following instinct to protect its offspring exhibits no virtue. Only a being who could choose evil but freely chooses good demonstrates genuine moral worth. Only a being who could refuse love but freely chooses to love exhibits authentic love. Only a being who could surrender to despair but freely chooses hope shows real courage. Here, Dostoevsky makes his most radical claim. Most human beings cannot tolerate this level of freedom. The burden proves too heavy, too terrifying, too overwhelming for the majority to bear. When faced with genuine freedom, most people will do absolutely anything to escape it. They will surrender their autonomy to political leaders who promise security and certainty. They will adopt rigid ideological systems that eliminate ambiguity and provide clear answers to every question. They will lose themselves in addictions, entertainment, and mindless routines. They will do whatever it takes to avoid the terrible responsibility of having to choose who they want to become. This creates a fundamental tragedy at the heart of human existence. The very quality that makes us human is precisely what most of us desperately want to escape. We desire freedom, but not the responsibility that accompanies it. We want to make choices but not face the consequences of our choosing. We wish to be good but not struggle with the constant temptation toward evil. We seek love but not the vulnerability that genuine love demands. Dostoevsky illustrates this tragedy through the underground man, one of the most psychologically complex characters in all of literature. This former government clerk has withdrawn from society into a dingy apartment where he writes bitter reflections about human nature. He possesses keen intelligence and painful self-awareness. He understands exactly what actions would improve his miserable existence. Yet he refuses to take those actions. He sabotages every opportunity for happiness. He destroys potential relationships before they can develop. He wallows in his suffering as if it were a precious treasure. Why does he behave this way? Because choosing misery is the only method available to him for asserting his freedom. By selecting suffering, he proves that he is not a machine programmed for happiness. The underground man would rather endure hell as a free being than experience paradise as a slave. This reveals the essence of human perversity that Dostoevsky discovered. Human beings will choose suffering over happiness if suffering is the only way to demonstrate their autonomy. We will act against our own interests simply to prove that we are not predictable. We will embrace irrationality as rebellion against any system that tries to reduce us to logical formulas. We would rather go to hell by our own choice than have heaven imposed upon us against our will. This insight carries profound implications for every domain of human concern. Any political system that attempts to perfect humanity by eliminating the capacity for free choice will ultimately fail and likely produce tyranny. Any ideology that promises to create happiness by removing the possibility of choosing unhappiness will generate rebellion and resentment. Any economic program that treats people as rational actors who always choose their self-interest will be perpetually surprised by human perversity. Any psychological theory that attempts to explain all behavior through deterministic causes will miss the irreducible element of freedom that defines our nature. But Dostoevsky does not stop with this negative insight. He also reveals what freedom looks like when exercised in service of love rather than mere rebellion. Characters like Alyosha Karamazov and Father Zosima demonstrate that choosing goodness, compassion, and self-sacrifice is possible. These characters are not naive or weak. They understand fully the horror of human existence, the reality of evil, and the temptation to despair. But they freely choose to respond with love anyway. This choice is not determined by their circumstances, genetics, or upbringing. It is a free act of will that transcends all natural and social causation. This positive freedom is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. It requires immense spiritual strength, moral courage, and willingness to suffer. It cannot be programmed, taught, or legislated into existence. Each individual must choose it freely in the depths of their own soul, and they must choose it again and again throughout their entire lifetime. The underground man represents the first fully developed portrait of modern alienation in world literature. He is not merely a fictional creation, but a prophetic vision of what human consciousness would become in the modern world. When you understand this character, you understand the psychological condition that afflicts millions of people living today. He begins his confession by declaring himself to be sick, spiteful, and unattractive. These are not random insults he hurls at himself. They are precise diagnoses of a new form of consciousness emerging in modernity. He is sick with excessive self-awareness that has paralyzed his capacity for spontaneous action. He is spiteful because his intelligence has revealed the futility and absurdity underlying all human endeavor. He is unattractive because his overactive mind has made natural human connection impossible. The underground man's fundamental problem is that he thinks too much. In earlier ages, people could act on instinct, tradition, or religious faith without endless questioning. But the underground man has been educated in modern scientific thinking and philosophical skepticism. He cannot accept anything on faith. He cannot act on impulse without analyzing his own motives. He cannot make any decision without seeing all possible objections to that decision. He is trapped in what we now call analysis paralysis. Though Dostoevsky understood this condition decades before psychology gave it a name, this excessive consciousness creates a terrible problem for action. The underground man knows exactly what he should do to improve his life. But knowing and doing are completely different things. He should exercise, but he analyzes his motives for exercise until the impulse dies. He should socialize, but he anticipates every possible embarrassment until he talks himself out of leaving his apartment. He should work on the meaningful projects, but he questions the ultimate value of all endeavor until he becomes paralyzed by doubt. Intelligence, which should be humanity's greatest gift, has become his greatest curse. The underground man has also lost the ability to feel genuine emotions. Everything he experiences passes through multiple layers of self-consciousness until the original feeling becomes completely distorted. When anger arises, he immediately begins analyzing it, questioning its legitimacy, anticipating how others will judge it, wondering about its deeper psychological causes. By the time this analysis concludes, the anger has transformed into something entirely different, usually self-hatred or bitter resentment. He cannot experience any emotion purely because his mind immediately begins dissecting and critiquing every feeling. This creates fundamental alienation from his own inner life. The underground man feels like a stranger to himself. He watches his own thoughts and feelings as if they belong to someone else. He becomes divided against himself, with one part constantly observing and judging the other parts. This internal division makes authentic self-expression impossible. Everything he says or does feels artificial and calculated because it has been filtered through so many layers of self-consciousness. Social anxiety compounds these problems. The underground man desperately wants human connection, but his self-consciousness makes normal interaction nearly impossible. When he enters a room with other people, he immediately begins analyzing how they perceive him. He notices every facial expression, every tone of voice, every gesture, and interprets them all as evidence of rejection or contempt. He becomes so focused on managing his image that he loses all ability to be genuinely present. His attempts at conversation feel forced and awkward because he is constantly monitoring himself rather than simply responding naturally. This social anxiety creates a vicious cycle that traps him in deeper isolation. Because he feels awkward in social situations, he begins avoiding them. But the more he isolates himself, the more awkward he becomes when he does venture out. Eventually, he develops elaborate theories about why other people are inferior and why solitude is actually preferable to human company. These theories are defense mechanisms protecting his wounded ego, but he convinces himself they represent sophisticated philosophical insights. He transforms his psychological problems into intellectual positions. The underground man also exhibits what psychologists would later call cognitive dissonance. He holds contradictory beliefs and desires simultaneously, and the tension between them drives him to increasingly irrational behavior. He claims to value reason above everything else, but then acts in completely irrational ways. He insists he wants to be left alone but becomes furious when people ignore him. He declares that he despises society but becomes desperate for social approval. He proclaims his independence from conventional morality but tortures himself with guilt over minor transgressions. These contradictions are not accidental or temporary. They are built into the structure of modern consciousness itself. The underground man has been educated to believe in reason, individual autonomy, and scientific materialism. But human beings are not purely rational creatures. These modern ideologies cannot satisfy deeper emotional and spiritual needs. The result is permanent internal conflict between what he thinks he should believe and what he actually experiences. His mind has been modernized, but his heart still yearns for meaning, connection, and transcendence. Dostoevsky shows that this conflict leads to a peculiar form of suffering distinctly modern in character. In earlier ages, people suffered from poverty, disease, war, and natural disasters. These forms of suffering were terrible but comprehensible and shared. The underground man suffers from something more subtle and isolating. He suffers from inability to believe in anything, to feel anything purely, or to connect authentically with anyone. He suffers from loss of meaning, purpose, and genuine emotion. This is the suffering of modern alienation, and it is more devastating than physical hardship because it attacks the very core of what makes life worth living. Unable to find genuine meaning or connection, the underground man begins to cultivate his suffering as if it were a work of art. He develops elaborate theories about why suffering is superior to happiness. He convinces himself that his alienation is a sign of superior sensitivity and intelligence. He transforms his psychological problems into badges of honor. This is exactly what happened to many intellectual movements in the 20th century. When people cannot find positive meaning, they often begin finding meaning in their victimhood, their alienation, or their rejection of conventional values. When Dostoevsky observed the intellectual currents of his century, he witnessed humanity rushing towards spiritual catastrophe with eyes wide open. The 19th century celebrated scientific progress, rational enlightenment, and utopian social planning. Intellectuals across Europe believed that human reason could solve every problem, eliminate all suffering, and construct perfect societies. They thought science would replace religion, education would eliminate ignorance, and proper social organization would end poverty, crime, and conflict. To most educated people of that era, these beliefs appeared obviously correct and morally admirable. But Dostoevsky perceived them as dangerous delusions that would lead to unprecedented destruction. The fundamental error of rationalism, according to Dostoevsky, is its complete misunderstanding of human nature. Rationalists assume that people are essentially logical creatures who make decisions based on careful calculation of self-interest. They believe that if you demonstrate to someone what truly serves their best interest, they will naturally pursue it. If people behave irrationally or self-destructively, it must be because they lack proper education or live in corrupted social conditions. Reform the education and transform the social conditions, and human behavior will automatically improve. This view seems reasonable and humane, but Dostoevsky recognized it as catastrophic misreading of human psychology. The problem is that human beings are not primarily rational creatures. We are emotional, spiritual, and often deeply irrational beings who frequently act against our own self-interest for psychological reasons that have nothing to do with logic. Sometimes we choose suffering because it feels more authentic than artificial happiness. Sometimes we reject good advice because accepting it would require admitting we need help. Sometimes we embrace destructive behaviors because they give us a sense of power or autonomy unavailable in healthy activities. Sometimes we simply act on impulse, instinct, or unconscious drives that operate below the level of rational awareness. Dostoevsky illustrates this through countless examples in his literary works. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment commits murder not because it serves his rational self-interest, but because he wants to prove he is extraordinary enough to transcend moral law. The underground man sabotages his own happiness, not because he lacks knowledge of what would make him happy, but because choosing misery is the only way he can assert his freedom. Ivan Karamazov develops elaborate philosophical arguments against divine existence, not because evidence clearly supports atheism, but because he cannot bear the emotional burden of believing in a deity who permits innocent suffering. In each case, behavior is driven by deep psychological needs that have nothing to do with rational calculation. This insight has devastating implications for all utopian political schemes. If people do not behave rationally, then rational social planning cannot create perfect societies. If human behavior is driven by unconscious psychological forces, then conscious education and reform cannot eliminate antisocial behavior. If people sometimes choose suffering over happiness for existential reasons, then no amount of material improvement can guarantee human contentment. Rationalist reformers are trying to solve human problems with tools fundamentally inadequate to the task. They are like physicians attempting to cure mental illness with surgery, or engineers trying to repair human relationships with mathematics. But Dostoevsky's critique penetrates deeper than simply pointing out the limitations of rational planning. He argues that excessive reliance on reason actually makes human problems worse rather than better. When people try to live purely rational lives, they sever themselves from their own emotional and spiritual depths. They become like the underground man, trapped inside their own heads, unable to feel genuine emotions or make authentic connections with other people. They lose touch with the sources of meaning, beauty, and transcendence that make life worth living. Rationalism does not solve the human condition. It impoverishes it. Scientific materialism creates even more serious problems. When people begin viewing themselves as nothing more than complex biological machines governed by physical and chemical laws, they lose their sense of human dignity and moral responsibility. If all human behavior can be explained in terms of genetics, neurology, and social conditioning, then concepts like free will, moral choice, and personal accountability become meaningless. Why should anyone feel guilty about their actions if those actions were determined by forces beyond their control? Why should anyone strive for moral improvement if morality is just a social construction with no objective reality? Why should anyone sacrifice immediate desires for higher principles if there are no higher principles, only competing biological drives and social pressures? Dostoevsky saw that scientific materialism would ultimately lead to nihilism, the belief that nothing has any ultimate meaning or value. If human beings are just accidental products of blind evolutionary forces, then our lives have no inherent purpose or significance. If consciousness is merely a byproduct of brain chemistry, then our deepest thoughts and feelings are nothing more than chemical reactions. If moral values are just social constructions that evolve to promote group survival, then they have no binding authority over individual behavior. The logical conclusion of scientific materialism is that existence is fundamentally absurd, and all human striving is ultimately meaningless. This realization drives sensitive people to despair, and less sensitive people to ruthless pursuit of power and pleasure. The political implications of this worldview are terrifying. If there are no objective moral truths, then might makes right. If human beings have no inherent dignity, then they can be manipulated, exploited, and destroyed without moral qualms. If traditional values are merely arbitrary social constructions, then they can be swept away and replaced with whatever ideology serves the interests of those in power. If reason is the only legitimate source of authority, then intellectuals have the right to impose their rational schemes on everyone else, regardless of what ordinary people want or believe. Dostoevsky recognized that this combination of nihilism and rationalism would eventually produce totalitarian movements, treating human beings as raw material for social engineering projects. One of Dostoevsky's most disturbing insights concerned his recognition that evil does not originate primarily from ignorance, poverty, or oppressive social conditions. Evil emerges from the human heart itself. This was a revolutionary and deeply unpopular idea in the 19th century, when most intellectuals believed human nature was fundamentally good, and that wicked behavior resulted from corrupted social institutions. If you could eliminate poverty, improve education, and reform social structures, they argued, you could eliminate crime, violence, and moral corruption. But Dostoevsky had witnessed too much of human nature in its raw form to accept such optimistic theories. He knew that evil was far more mysterious, persistent, and deeply rooted than social reformers wanted to admit. Dostoevsky's understanding of evil was forged through his own experience in the Siberian prison camp, where he spent 4 years among murderers, thieves, and violent criminals. He expected to find that these men had been driven to crime by desperate circumstances or lack of proper education. Instead, he discovered that many had committed their crimes not from necessity, but from choice. Some seemed to enjoy violence for its own sake. Others appeared to have committed murder or robbery as a form of self-assertion or rebellion against social authority. Still others seemed motivated by a desire to experience the ultimate transgression, to discover what it felt like to cross the line separating civilized behavior from absolute barbarity. What disturbed Dostoevsky most was not that these men were evil, but that they were recognizably human. They were not monsters or beasts, but people who shared the same basic psychological makeup as everyone else. They had the same capacity for reason, emotion, and moral understanding as law-abiding citizens. Many were intelligent, some were charming, and a few were even capable of genuine kindness in certain circumstances. But they had made fundamental choices about how to live that had led them down dark paths. If people like this could become violent criminals, then the potential for evil existed in everyone. This realization forced Dostoevsky to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature. We are not blank slates who become good or evil depending on our environment. We are not rational calculators who always choose what serves our best interests. We are complex beings with contradictory impulses, including genuine impulses toward evil. Every human being contains the capacity for both sainthood and criminality. Which path we take depends not primarily on our circumstances, but on the moral choices we make in the depths of our souls. Dostoevsky explores this theme most powerfully through the character of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov is an intelligent, sensitive young man from a respectable family. He has received good education and holds progressive social views. He is not driven to crime by poverty or desperation, though these factors play a role in his situation. Instead, he chooses to commit murder because he wants to prove to himself that he is an extraordinary individual who can transcend conventional morality. He has convinced himself through rational arguments that killing a worthless old woman and redistributing her money to deserving poor people would be a morally justified act. But Dostoevsky reveals that Raskolnikov's rational justifications are elaborate self-deceptions. The real motivation for his crime is psychological rather than philosophical. He wants to experience the ultimate assertion of his own will and power. He wants to prove that he is not bound by moral rules that constrain ordinary people. He wants to feel what it is like to hold the power of life and death over another human being. The murder is not really about helping the poor or serving some greater good. It is about feeding his own ego and satisfying his deepest psychological needs. What makes Raskolnikov so disturbing is that his psychological profile is not fundamentally different from that of many intellectuals and political activists. How many people have committed terrible acts in the name of serving humanity? How many revolutionaries have justified murder and terrorism by claiming to serve the greater good? How many ideologues have convinced themselves that their personal resentments and power drives are actually noble commitments to justice and progress? Raskolnikov represents the dangerous combination of intellectual sophistication and moral blindness that characterizes so many modern movements. He is the prototype of the educated person who uses rational arguments to justify fundamentally irrational and evil behavior. Dostoevsky also understood that evil often emerges not from dramatic moral failures, but from small compromises and gradual spiritual deterioration. Most people do not wake up one morning and decide to become criminals or tyrants. Instead, they make a series of seemingly minor moral compromises that slowly erode their capacity for ethical judgment. They tell small lies that prepare them for bigger lies. They rationalize minor selfishness that prepares them for major selfishness. They ignore small injustices that prepare them to participate in larger injustices. Over time, these compromises create a pattern of moral numbness that makes serious evil possible. This process is illustrated brilliantly in the brothers Karamazov through the character of Smerdyakov, who murders his father Fyodor. Smerdyakov is not born evil, but grows up in an environment of moral corruption and cynicism. He observes the hypocrisy and selfishness of the adults around him and gradually learns to manipulate others for his own advantage. He develops a philosophy of nihilistic opportunism that justifies any action serving his interests. By the time he commits murder, he's already lost any genuine capacity for moral feeling. The crime is simply the logical culmination of a lifelong process of spiritual deterioration. But Dostoevsky's most profound insight into the nature of evil concerns its relationship to freedom. Evil is not an unfortunate accident or temporary aberration that can be eliminated through proper social engineering. Evil is an inevitable consequence of human freedom itself. If people are truly free to choose between good and evil, then some will choose evil. If people have the capacity for genuine love, then they also have the capacity for genuine hatred. If people can sacrifice themselves for others, then they can also sacrifice others for themselves. Freedom necessarily includes the freedom to choose wrongly. This means that evil can never be completely eliminated from human existence, No philosophical problem tormented Dostoevsky more profoundly than the existence of innocent suffering. How can a loving and omnipotent deity permit children to be tortured, abused, and murdered? How can we believe in divine justice when the world overflows with undeserved pain and seemingly random cruelty? These questions strike at the very foundation of religious faith and moral understanding. Most religious thinkers attempt to answer them with theological explanations about free will, the greater good, or the mysterious ways of divine providence. But Dostoevsky was too honest and too intimately acquainted with suffering to accept comfortable answers. Instead, he presented the problem of innocent suffering in its starkest and most emotionally devastating form. The most powerful statement of this problem emerges through the character of Ivan Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov. Ivan is a brilliant intellectual who has studied philosophy, theology, and history. He understands all the traditional arguments for divine existence and the standard explanations for why a good deity permits evil. But he has also collected stories of innocent children being tortured and murdered by adults. These stories are not abstract philosophical examples, but detailed accounts of actual human suffering that Ivan has gathered from newspapers and historical records. When he confronts the reality of this suffering, all theological explanations collapse into meaninglessness. Ivan tells his brother Alyosha about a 5-year-old girl whose parents tortured her for minor infractions. They would beat her mercilessly, lock her in a freezing outhouse overnight during winter, and force her to consume her own waste. The child would pray to the divine for protection, but no protection arrived. Eventually, her parents tortured her to death. Ivan asks Alyosha a simple but devastating question. Can you understand why a little creature who cannot even comprehend what is being done to her should beat her small heart with her tiny fist in the darkness and cold, weeping her tears of blood to the divine for protection? And what can we say about a deity who hears such prayers and does nothing? Ivan presents many such stories, each more heartbreaking than the last. A general orders his hunting dogs to tear apart a peasant boy because the child accidentally injured one of the general's favorite hounds. Soldiers in wartime entertain themselves by throwing infants into the air and catching them on their bayonets. Parents across the world beat, starve, and violate their own children while the children cry out for help that never arrives. These are not isolated incidents, but patterns of cruelty that have repeated themselves throughout human history. Every generation produces new examples of innocent suffering that seem to make a mockery of any belief in divine justice or cosmic meaning. The standard religious response to such suffering is to say that the divine works in mysterious ways that human beings cannot comprehend. Perhaps the suffering serves some greater purpose that will be revealed in the afterlife. Perhaps it is necessary for the development of human character or the achievement of some greater good. Perhaps the suffering will be compensated by eternal happiness in paradise. But Ivan rejects all such explanations as morally obscene. No greater good could possibly justify the torture of innocent children. No eternal compensation could make up for undeserved agony. If the achievement of some cosmic harmony requires even one child to suffer unjustly, then Ivan wants nothing to do with such harmony. Ivan presents his rejection of the divine world in terms that are both logically rigorous and emotionally overwhelming. He tells Alyosha that he does not reject the deity himself, but he cannot accept the world that this deity has created. He refuses to participate in any cosmic plan built on the foundation of innocent suffering. Even if he could be shown that all suffering will eventually be justified and all injustice made right, he would still reject admission to such a universe. Some things are simply too precious to be sacrificed for any purpose, no matter how noble. The tears of a tortured child cannot be wiped away by any amount of future happiness or cosmic justice. This position is not atheism in the ordinary sense. Ivan is not arguing that the divine does not exist or that religious claims are factually incorrect. He is making a moral argument against the universe itself. Even if the divine exists, and even if there is a divine plan that will ultimately make everything right, Ivan refuses to endorse such a plan. He would rather be condemned than participate in a cosmic system that treats innocent suffering as an acceptable means to any end. This is rebellion not against divine existence, but against divine justice. Ivan's rebellion culminates in his famous parable of the Grand Inquisitor. In this story, the divine figure returns to Earth during the Spanish Inquisition and begins performing miracles and healing the sick. The Grand Inquisitor, who represents the highest authority of the religious institution, has him arrested. He visits the divine prisoner in his cell and explains why the church must reject and execute him. The problem is that this figure offered humanity freedom, but freedom is a burden that most people cannot bear. The church has corrected his mistake by offering people security, certainty, and relief from the terrible responsibility of having to choose for themselves. The Grand Inquisitor argues that the divine figure was wrong to reject the three temptations offered in the wilderness. The adversary offered to turn stones into bread, representing the promise to solve human material needs. The divine figure rejected this, insisting that people do not live by bread alone. But the Inquisitor points out that most people are not spiritual enough to care about anything beyond their physical survival. By refusing to solve the problem of hunger and poverty, the divine figure condemned the majority of humanity to perpetual suffering. A truly loving deity would have chosen to feed people rather than preserving their spiritual freedom. The adversary also offered the chance to prove divinity by performing an undeniable miracle. This represents the power to compel belief through overwhelming evidence. The divine figure rejected this as well, insisting that faith must be freely chosen rather than forced through supernatural demonstration. But the Inquisitor argues that most people desperately want certainty and are tormented by doubt. By refusing to provide irrefutable proof, the divine figure left humanity to struggle with agonizing questions about existence and meaning. A truly compassionate deity would have provided clear evidence that would eliminate all doubt and give people the security of certain knowledge. Finally, the adversary offered dominion over all earthly kingdoms, representing the power to create perfect social and political institutions. The divine figure rejected this too, insisting that his realm was not of this world. But the Inquisitor argues that most people need strong leadership and clear social order to live decent lives. By refusing to establish a perfect earthly kingdom, the divine figure left humanity to struggle with war, injustice, and political chaos. A truly wise deity would have taken political power and used it to create conditions under which all people could live in peace and prosperity. The Grand Inquisitor concludes that the Church has corrected the divine figure's mistakes by providing exactly what the adversary offered, and he rejected. The Church feeds people through its charitable works, provides certainty through its doctrines and authority, and creates social order through its political influence. In doing so, It has made the vast majority of humanity much happier than they would have been under the original divine plan. Only a small number of spiritually exceptional individuals can handle the freedom that was initially offered. For everyone else, freedom is a curse rather than a blessing. The Church has taken this burden upon itself and given people the security and happiness they actually want. This parable presents the problem of innocent suffering in its most sophisticated form. If the divine truly loves humanity, why does he permit people to suffer when he has the power to prevent that suffering? The only possible answer seems to be that the divine values human freedom more than human happiness. But this means that the divine is willing to sacrifice the welfare of actual people for the sake of an abstract principle. Is this really love, or is it a form of cosmic cruelty dressed up in religious language? Ivan's rebellion forces us to confront the possibility that the universe itself is morally unacceptable. Dostoevsky does not provide easy answers to these devastating questions. He presents Ivan's arguments with complete intellectual honesty and emotional power. But he also shows us the human cost of Ivan's rebellion. Ivan's rejection of the divine world leads him to a philosophy of nihilistic despair. If there is no cosmic justice, then there are no objective moral truths. If innocent suffering is meaningless, then all human striving is meaningless. If the divine does not care about human welfare, then perhaps nothing matters at all. Ivan's intellectual integrity leads him to conclusions that make life unbearable. The alternative to Ivan's rebellion is represented by his brother Alyosha, who accepts the mystery of innocent suffering without being able to explain it. Alyosha does not have better theological arguments than Ivan. He cannot provide satisfying explanations for why children suffer, but he chooses to trust in divine goodness despite evidence that seems to contradict it. He responds to suffering not with intellectual analysis, but with practical love and compassion. He cannot solve the problem of evil, but he can work to reduce actual suffering in the lives of real people. His faith is not based on rational arguments, but on his direct experience of grace and redemption. Dostoevsky suggests that the problem of innocent suffering cannot be solved through philosophical reasoning. It can only be lived through and responded to with love. This does not make the suffering any less real or any less tragic, but it offers a way of maintaining both intellectual honesty and spiritual hope in the face of life's deepest mysteries. The parable of the Grand Inquisitor also functions as Dostoevsky's most powerful political prophecy. Writing decades before the rise of totalitarian movements, he predicted with astonishing accuracy how such systems would operate and why they would appeal to millions of people. The Inquisitor's vision perfectly describes the appeal of both fascist and communist regimes that would emerge in the 20th century. These movements offered their populations exactly what the Grand Inquisitor promised. They promised to solve economic problems through centralized planning and state control, representing the promise of bread. They promised certainty through official ideology that would answer all questions and eliminate doubt, representing the promise of miracle. They promised strong leadership that would make all important decisions and relieve ordinary people of political responsibility, representing the promise of authority. And millions of people embraced these systems precisely because they offered relief from the burden of freedom. The parable explains why democratic societies are always fragile and why freedom is always in danger of being lost. Democracy requires citizens to educate themselves about complex issues, make difficult choices, and accept responsibility for the consequences of their decisions. This is hard work that many people would rather avoid. It is much easier to let someone else make the decisions and then blame them when things go wrong. It is much more comfortable to have clear ideological answers than to wrestle with ambiguous questions that have no easy solutions. The appeal of authoritarianism is not primarily economic or political, but psychological. It offers relief from the existential burden of being free. But Dostoevsky does not end the parable with the inquisitor's monologue. After listening silently to the entire argument, the divine figure responds not with words, but with a simple action. He approaches the old inquisitor and gently kisses him. This kiss contains no argument, no refutation, no explanation. It is simply an expression of love for a human being who has lost his way. The inquisitor is deeply moved by this gesture, but he does not change his mind. He releases the divine prisoner and tells him never to return. The figure leaves in silence, and the inquisitor continues with his work of managing humanity for its own good. This ending suggests that the choice between freedom and security cannot be resolved through rational argument. Both positions have compelling logic behind them. The choice ultimately comes down to a fundamental decision about what human beings are and what they are capable of becoming. The divine figure represents faith in human potential and the belief that freedom is worth the cost it requires. The inquisitor represents compassionate realism about human limitations and the belief that most people need protection from their own freedom. Each position contains both truth and error, and the tension between them can never be completely resolved. What Dostoevsky shows us is that this choice is always before us both individually and collectively. We can choose the path of freedom with all its risks, uncertainties, and painful responsibilities. Or we can choose the path of security with all its comforts, certainties, and protected dependencies. Neither choice is obviously right or wrong, and both exact a price from those who make them. But the choice itself cannot be avoided, and the consequences of our choice will shape not only our own lives, but the lives of future generations. For Dostoevsky, the conflict between different forms of religious practice was not merely a theological dispute, but a battle for the soul of humanity itself. He believed that Western forms of religious expression, both Roman Catholic and Protestant, had fundamentally betrayed the original message. In pursuing worldly power, intellectual respectability, and social influence, Western churches had lost touch with the spiritual essence of authentic faith. Only Russian Orthodoxy, he argued, had preserved the genuine spirit of humility, suffering, and mystical union with the divine. This was not mere nationalist prejudice, but a carefully developed philosophical and theological position that shaped his entire worldview. Dostoevsky's critique of Roman Catholicism was particularly harsh and uncompromising. He saw the Catholic institution as the direct descendant of the Roman Empire, more concerned with political power than spiritual truth. The Church had corrupted the original teaching by trying to create an earthly kingdom rather than focusing on the kingdom of heaven. It had replaced the spiritual authority of love and humility with the temporal authority of law and coercion. It had substituted rational theology for mystical experience and bureaucratic organization for authentic spiritual community. In Dostoevsky's view, Catholicism represented everything that the original figure had rejected during his 3 temptations in the wilderness. The Grand Inquisitor was Dostoevsky's symbolic representation of Catholic religious practice. The inquisitor genuinely believes he is serving humanity by taking away the terrible burden of spiritual freedom. He has convinced himself that most people are too weak and ignorant to handle the responsibility of making their own religious choices. Therefore, the church must make these choices for them, providing clear doctrines, absolute authority, and relief from spiritual uncertainty. This is presented as an act of compassion, but Dostoevsky saw it as fundamental betrayal. By removing freedom, the church had also removed the possibility of genuine faith, love, and spiritual growth. Dostoevsky argued that this corruption was not accidental but inevitable given Catholic theology and institutional structure. The Catholic emphasis on papal authority and church tradition had replaced the direct personal relationship between the individual believer and the divine. The development of sophisticated theological systems had replaced simple faith with intellectual complexity. The accumulation of worldly wealth and political power had corrupted the church's spiritual mission. The result was a form of religious practice that was authentic in name only, having lost the essential spirit that made it revolutionary and transformative. Protestantism, in Dostoevsky's view, was even worse than Catholicism because it carried the logic of Western religious thought to its ultimate conclusion. By rejecting papal authority and church tradition, Protestants had opened the door to complete individualism and relativism. If every believer could interpret Scripture for themselves, then there was no objective religious truth at all. If salvation came through faith alone, rather than through participation in a spiritual community, then religion became a purely private matter with no social or cultural significance. Protestantism had inadvertently prepared the way for secularization by making religion optional and subjective. It was a transitional phase between traditional religious practice and complete atheism. Dostoevsky saw socialism as the logical culmination of both Catholic and Protestant errors. Socialism promised to create the perfect earthly society that Catholicism had sought through church authority and political power. It offered the individual liberation that Protestantism had promised through rejection of external authority. But it achieved both goals by eliminating the divine entirely and putting human reason and human will in the place of divine providence. Socialism was the final form of the Western religious heresy, the attempt to create heaven on earth through human effort rather than divine grace. It retained the concern for justice and equality while rejecting the understanding of human nature and divine providence. Against all these Western deviations, Dostoevsky held up Russian Orthodoxy as the true embodiment of authentic faith. Orthodoxy had never sought worldly power or tried to create earthly kingdoms. It had preserved the mystical and contemplative dimensions that Western churches had lost in their pursuit of rational theology and social influence. Orthodox believers understood that the spiritual life was primarily about suffering, humility, and union with the divine rather than about intellectual understanding or moral achievement. They recognized that the church was a community of sinners seeking redemption rather than an institution of saints dispensing salvation. They maintained the primitive understanding that this world was fallen and that ultimate hope lay in the world to come. The Orthodox emphasis on suffering was particularly important to Dostoevsky's religious philosophy. While Western religious practice often tried to minimize or explain away the reality of suffering, Orthodoxy embraced suffering as an essential part of the spiritual path. Through suffering, believers learned compassion for others who suffer. Through suffering, they were purified of pride, selfishness, and illusion. Through suffering, they participated in the passion itself and came to understand the mystery of redemption. Suffering was not an unfortunate accident to be eliminated, but a sacred opportunity for spiritual growth and transformation. This understanding of suffering was connected to the Orthodox concept of kenosis, the self-emptying love demonstrated in the Incarnation and Crucifixion. True, authentic love required the complete surrender of self-will and the willingness to sacrifice everything for the good of others. This was not mere altruism or humanitarian concern, but mystical participation in divine love for creation. Such love could not be achieved through moral effort or intellectual understanding, but only through grace received in the context of genuine spiritual community. It required the kind of humility and self-surrender that Western individualism made almost impossible to achieve. Dostoevsky illustrated these orthodox principles through characters like Alyosha Karamazov, Prince Myshkin, and Father Zosima. These characters embody the orthodox ideal of holy simplicity, combining deep spiritual wisdom with childlike innocence. They do not rely on theological arguments or moral reasoning to guide their actions. Instead, they respond to each situation with spontaneous love and compassion, trusting that the divine will work through their simple faithfulness. They are willing to suffer for others and to forgive even the most terrible wrongs. They see the divine image in every human being, no matter how degraded or sinful that person might appear. At the very center of Dostoevsky's philosophical universe lies a simple but revolutionary claim. Love is not merely one human emotion among others, not merely a psychological drive or social bond. Love is the fundamental force that holds the universe together, the ultimate reality behind all appearances, the final answer to every philosophical question. This is not the sentimental affection celebrated in popular culture, nor the rational benevolence advocated by moral philosophers. It is a cosmic principle that manifests itself most clearly in suffering, sacrifice, and the willingness to bear the pain of others. For Dostoevsky, love in this ultimate sense is identical with the divine, and the capacity for such love is what makes human beings capable of redemption. This understanding of love emerged from Dostoevsky's own experience of suffering and spiritual transformation. During his years in the Siberian prison camp, he witnessed the worst aspects of human nature, but also moments of unexpected compassion and self-sacrifice. He saw hardened criminals risk their lives to help fellow prisoners. He observed acts of kindness that had no rational explanation or practical benefit. He experienced moments when the barriers between self and other seemed to dissolve, and he felt a profound connection to all suffering humanity. These experiences convinced him that beneath the surface of human cruelty and selfishness lay a deeper reality of universal love that could transform even the most degraded souls. But Dostoevsky's concept of love was paradoxical and often difficult to comprehend. True love, he believed, could only emerge through the complete acceptance of suffering. Those who tried to avoid pain either for themselves or others could never develop the spiritual depth necessary for genuine love. Those who sought happiness and pleasure as their primary goals would remain trapped in selfishness and superficiality. Only those who were willing to embrace suffering as a path to spiritual growth could transcend their ego boundaries and participate in the universal love that connected all beings. This meant that love often looked like its opposite, appearing as tragedy, loss, and heartbreak, rather than joy and fulfillment. Dostoevsky illustrated this paradox through characters who embody different aspects of love and its absence. Prince Myshkin in The Idiot represents pure innocent love that seeks nothing for itself and gives everything to others. But Mishkin's love is tragic because it cannot protect him or those he loves from suffering. His very goodness becomes a source of destruction because the world is not prepared to receive such unconditional love. Yet Dostoevsky suggests that Mishkin's apparent failure is actually a form of success because his love plants seeds that may bear fruit in the future. Even when love cannot prevent suffering, it can transform the meaning of that suffering and point toward ultimate redemption. Alyosha Karamazov represents a more mature and practical form of love that has learned to work within the limitations of human nature and social reality. Alyosha does not try to save everyone or solve all problems through the sheer force of his goodness. Instead, he responds to each person and situation with specific acts of compassion that are appropriate to the circumstances. He listens without judging, forgives without conditions, and helps without expecting gratitude or recognition. His love is quiet and undemonstrative, but it has a transformative effect on almost everyone he encounters. Through Alyosha, Dostoevsky shows how love can be both completely selfless and completely practical. The contrast between these loving characters and those who lack love reveals the central tragedy of human existence. Characters like Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, and the underground man are capable of brilliant intellectual analysis and profound emotional sensitivity. But they are trapped in their own subjectivity and cannot break through to genuine connection with others. Their intelligence becomes a prison that separates them from the spontaneous flow of life and love. They understand everything except the most important thing, which is how to love and be loved. Their tragedy is not that they are evil, but that they are isolated from the source of all meaning and joy. Dostoevsky believed that this isolation was the fundamental problem of modern civilization. Rationalism, individualism, and materialism had taught people to view themselves as separate atoms competing for scarce resources in an indifferent universe. This worldview made genuine love almost impossible because it was based on the assumption that self-interest and altruism were fundamentally opposed. People could cooperate when it served their mutual interests, but they could not love in the ultimate sense because they could not transcend their ego boundaries. The result was a civilization that was technologically advanced but spiritually impoverished, capable of great achievements but incapable of genuine happiness or meaning. The alternative to this modern predicament was what Dostoevsky called sobornost, a Russian Orthodox concept that refers to spiritual unity achieved through love. Sobornost is not mere cooperation or social solidarity, but mystical participation in the divine love that connects all beings. When people experience sobornost, they discover that their deepest interests are not separate from the interests of others, but identical with them. They realize that the boundaries between self and other are illusions created by ego, and that true fulfillment comes through self-transcendence rather than self-assertion. This realization cannot be achieved through intellectual effort or moral willpower, but only through grace received in the context of genuine spiritual community. Father Zosima in The Brothers. Karamazov embodies this ideal of sobornost and serves as Dostoevsky's most complete representation of how love transforms human consciousness. Zosima teaches that every human being is responsible for everyone else, and that all suffering is shared suffering. When one person sins, all humanity is diminished. When one person is redeemed, all humanity is lifted up. This interconnectedness is not a moral obligation imposed from outside, but a spiritual reality that becomes visible to those who have learned to love truly. Zosima can see the divine image in every person because he has transcended the ego boundaries that normally separate people from each other. But Dostoevsky was too honest and too experienced with human nature to present love as an easy solution to human problems. True love requires enormous sacrifice and often leads to what appears to be failure and defeat. Those who love most deeply often suffer most intensely because they open themselves to the pain of others as well as their own pain. Love does not eliminate evil or prevent tragedy. It transforms the meaning of evil and tragedy by placing them in the context of ultimate redemption. This transformation is real and profound, but it is often invisible to those who judge by worldly standards of success and failure. Writing in the 1870s, decades before the rise of fascist and communist movements, Dostoevsky predicted with astonishing accuracy how totalitarian systems would operate and why they would appeal to millions of people. In his novel, Demons, he created a prophetic vision of revolutionary terrorism that anticipated the tactics and psychology of 20th century political extremism. But his insight went deeper than mere political prediction. He understood the spiritual and psychological roots of totalitarianism and why modern civilization was inevitably moving toward unprecedented forms of tyranny. His warnings were ignored by most of his contemporaries, who viewed his political novels as hysterical overreactions to minor social problems. History proved that Dostoevsky was not hysterical enough. The central insight behind Dostoevsky's political prophecy was his understanding that totalitarianism emerges not from traditional authoritarianism, but from the collapse of traditional beliefs and institutions. Traditional tyrants claimed authority based on divine right, inherited legitimacy, or military conquest. They ruled through fear and force, but they did not typically try to control every aspect of their subjects' lives or reshape human nature itself. Modern totalitarianism, by contrast, emerges from democratic and egalitarian movements that claim to represent the will of the people and the march of historical progress. Totalitarian leaders present themselves not as conquerors, but as servants of humanity who are working to eliminate suffering and create perfect societies. This makes their tyranny far more dangerous and more difficult to resist than traditional despotism. Dostoevsky saw that this new form of tyranny would emerge from the philosophical ideas that were gaining popularity among European intellectuals. Materialism taught that human beings were nothing more than complex machines governed by physical and social laws. If this were true, then human behavior could be predicted and controlled through the proper manipulation of environmental conditions. Rationalism taught that reason could solve all human problems and create perfect social institutions. If this were true, then those who possessed superior rational knowledge had the right and obligation to impose their plans on everyone else. Atheism taught that there were no objective moral truths or transcendent sources of meaning. If this were true, then moral values were simply human constructions that could be changed at will to serve political purposes. The combination of these ideas created a perfect intellectual foundation for totalitarian politics. If human beings were merely biological machines, then they had no inherent dignity or rights that would limit what could be done to them in service of social goals. If reason was the only legitimate source of authority, then intellectuals and planners had the right to override the preferences and traditions of ordinary people. If moral values were arbitrary social constructions, then any action could be justified if it served the supposedly rational goals of the revolutionary movement. These ideas, which seem progressive and humane to 19th century liberals, contain the seeds of unprecedented cruelty and oppression. In Demons, Dostoevsky illustrated how these abstract philosophical ideas would translate into concrete political action. The novel's revolutionary characters begin with genuine concern about social injustice and sincere desire to help the oppressed. But their commitment to ideological purity gradually overwhelms their basic human decency and moral sense. They become willing to lie, steal, and murder in service of their cause because they have convinced themselves that their personal feelings and moral scruples are obstacles to the greater good. They develop elaborate theoretical justifications for actions that they would have considered obviously evil before their ideological conversion. The result is a form of evil that is far more dangerous than traditional criminality, because it operates with a clear conscience and claims moral legitimacy. Dostoevsky understood that this kind of ideological fanaticism would appeal particularly to educated young people who had lost traditional religious faith but retained the need for meaning and purpose. Revolutionary movements offered these individuals a sense of mission and significance that secular culture could not provide. By joining a cause that promised to transform the world, they could feel that their lives mattered in some ultimate sense. By identifying with the supposedly inevitable march of historical progress, they could feel that they were on the winning side of a cosmic struggle between good and evil. By embracing an ideology that explained everything and promised to solve all problems, they could escape from the uncertainty and ambiguity that characterized modern life. Revolutionary movements functioned as substitute religions for people who could no longer believe in traditional religions. But Dostoevsky also saw that these movements would inevitably betray their own ideals and become tyrannical. The same philosophical assumptions that justified revolutionary violence against the old order would eventually justify tyrannical control over the new order. If human beings were rational machines, then they could be programmed to behave in socially beneficial ways. If traditional moral value were obstacles to progress, then people would need to be re-educated to accept new values. If individual preferences conflicted with collective goals, then individual preferences would have to be suppressed for the greater good. The logic that justified revolution would inevitably lead to totalitarian control once the revolutionaries gained power. The character of Shigalyov in Demons represents this progression from revolutionary idealism to totalitarian planning. Shigalyov begins with the goal of creating perfect equality and freedom for all humanity. But when he works out the practical implications of his ideas, he discovers that perfect equality requires the complete elimination of individual freedom. His ideal society would divide humanity into two groups: a small elite who would make all decisions and a large mass who would live in conditions of perfect equality but complete subservience. Shigalyov presents this not as a betrayal of his original ideals, but as their logical fulfillment. True freedom and equality, he argues, can only be achieved through the elimination of the false freedom and equality that allows some people to dominate others. This paradox runs through all totalitarian movements. They'll promise liberation but deliver enslavement. They claim to serve the people but end up treating the people as raw material for their social engineering projects. They begin with humanitarian goals but end up committing atrocities that surpass anything achieved by traditional tyrants. This is not an accidental corruption of originally good intentions, but the inevitable result of the philosophical assumptions on which these movements are based. Long before existentialism became a recognized philosophical movement, Dostoevsky had identified and dramatized its central insights. Through characters like the underground man, Raskolnikov, and Ivan Karamazov, he explored themes that would later become the foundation of existentialist thought. The absurdity of existence, the burden of freedom, the anxiety of choice, and the search for authentic selfhood in a meaningless universe. But Dostoevsky's exploration of these themes was different from the secular existentialism that would emerge in the 20th century, because it was grounded in a profound spiritual struggle rather than a rejection of all spiritual possibilities. For Dostoevsky, the confrontation with meaninglessness was not the end of the philosophical journey, but the beginning of a deeper search for transcendent meaning. The underground man represents the first fully developed existentialist figure in world literature. He is acutely aware that his existence precedes any essence or meaning that he might try to impose upon it. He knows that he is radically free to choose who he wants to be, but he also knows that this freedom is a terrible burden that most people try to escape. He understands that all human values and institutions are human constructions rather than objective features of reality. He recognizes that reason cannot provide ultimate guidance for human action because reason itself is just another human tool with no transcendent authority. These insights anticipate the central themes of existentialist philosophy by several decades. But the underground man's response to these insights is profoundly different from that of later existentialist thinkers. Instead of embracing his freedom and creating his own values, he becomes paralyzed by the recognition of his radical responsibility for his choices. Instead of affirming life despite its apparent meaninglessness, he retreats into bitter isolation and self-destructive behavior. Instead of finding authenticity through the acceptance of anxiety and uncertainty, he becomes consumed by resentment and spite. The underground man shows us what happens when existentialist insights are divorced from any spiritual or transcendent framework that could give them positive meaning. Without the divine or some other source of objective value, existential freedom becomes a curse rather than a blessing. Dostoevsky's exploration of the divided self was equally prophetic and influential. His characters are not unified personalities, but complex battlegrounds where conflicting impulses, beliefs, and desires struggle for dominance. Raskolnikov contains both a potential saint and a potential criminal, and his actions emerge from the temporary victory of one aspect of his personality over others. Ivan Karamazov is simultaneously a believer and an atheist, capable of profound religious insight and equally profound religious rebellion. The underground man is both a penetrating social critic and a pathetic failure who cannot apply his insights to his own life. These characters anticipate the modern psychological understanding of personality as multiple and contradictory, rather than single and coherent. This division of the self creates what existentialists would later call authenticity problems. If we contain multiple conflicting selves, which one represents our true identity? If our conscious thoughts and stated values conflict with our unconscious drives and actual behavior, which should we trust? If we can observe ourselves thinking and feeling, who is the observer and who is the observed? These questions torment Dostoevsky's characters and drive them to increasingly desperate attempts to achieve some kind of unified selfhood. But their efforts usually fail because the division is built into the structure of human consciousness itself. Dostoevsky understood that this divided consciousness was both a burden and an opportunity. The same self-awareness that makes authentic action difficult also makes moral growth possible. The same capacity for self-observation that creates anxiety and paralysis also enables genuine self-knowledge and repentance. The same freedom that allows people to choose evil also allows them to choose good. The divided self is the price we pay for being human, but it is also what makes genuine humanity possible. Without the capacity to step outside ourselves and observe our own thoughts and actions, we would be no different from animals acting on instinct. The existential themes in Dostoevsky's work also include a profound exploration of what would later be called bad faith, the tendency to deny one's freedom and responsibility by pretending to be determined by external forces. Many of his characters try to escape the burden of choice by convincing themselves that their actions are determined by their social circumstances, their psychological makeup, or their philosophical beliefs. Raskolnikov claims that his murder was justified by his theory about extraordinary individuals, but this is really an attempt to avoid taking full responsibility for his free choice to kill. The underground man blames his problems on social conditions and psychological determinism, but this is really an excuse for his refusal to take positive action to improve his life. These characters demonstrate how easy it is to use sophisticated intellectual analysis as a way of avoiding genuine moral responsibility. But Dostoevsky also shows us characters who achieve what existentialists would call authentic existence by fully accepting their freedom and responsibility. Alyosha Karamazov does not try to escape the burden of choice by appealing to external authorities or deterministic explanations. He takes full responsibility for his actions and their consequences, while remaining open to grace and guidance from beyond himself. Sonia Marmeladova, in Crime and Punishment, freely chooses to sacrifice herself for her family while maintaining her dignity and moral integrity. These characters show that authenticity is possible, but it requires enormous courage and spiritual strength. It cannot be achieved through intellectual analysis alone, but requires a fundamental transformation of one's relationship to existence itself. The existential dimension of Dostoevsky's work is most clearly visible in his treatment of death and mortality. His characters are constantly aware that they will die, and that this fact renders all their projects and concerns ultimately meaningless from a cosmic perspective. This awareness of mortality creates both anxiety and urgency. If life is short and death is certain, then every choice matters enormously, because there may not be opportunities to correct mistakes or try alternative paths. But if death makes everything meaningless, then no choice matters at all, because all outcomes lead to the same ultimate destination. This paradox creates the existential tension that drives much of the psychological drama in Dostoevsky's novels. Dostoevsky's influence on later existentialist thinkers was enormous, though often unacknowledged. Kierkegaard, who is usually considered the father of existentialism, was deeply influenced by Dostoevsky's exploration of anxiety, despair, and the leap of faith. Nietzsche's concept of the Overman and his critique of conventional morality owe much to characters like Raskolnikov and Ivan Karamazov. Sartre's analysis of bad faith and the burden of freedom clearly draws on insights that Dostoevsky dramatized decades earlier. Camus' treatment of the absurd and the rebel shows the influence of characters like the underground man and Ivan Karamazov. Even Heidegger's analysis of authentic existence and being toward death reflects themes that Dostoevsky explored in psychological rather than philosophical terms. At the very center of Dostoevsky's philosophical legacy lies an eternal battle between faith and doubt that can never be definitively resolved through rational argument or empirical evidence. Combined with his revolutionary understanding that suffering is the fundamental condition through which human beings achieve spiritual growth and authentic meaning. These twin insights form the foundation of his enduring relevance and his prophetic vision for humanity's future. This struggle is not merely an intellectual debate about divine existence, but an existential crisis that affects every aspect of human existence. While suffering is not an unfortunate accident to be eliminated, it is the crucible in which human souls are refined and transformed. Together, these insights create a philosophy that is both deeply challenging and ultimately redemptive. Dostoevsky himself embodied this struggle throughout his entire life. His arrest, imprisonment, and years in Siberia subjected his faith to the most severe possible tests, while teaching him that extreme suffering could serve as a pathway to spiritual transformation. He witnessed cruelty and suffering that seemed to make a mockery of belief in a loving deity. Yet he also observed how those prisoners who accepted their suffering without becoming consumed by hatred often developed extraordinary capacities for kindness, wisdom, and moral insight. This experience convinced him that the deepest forms of human wisdom, compassion, and spiritual insight emerge only through profound suffering that cannot be avoided or easily resolved. The mature Dostoevsky, who emerged from this ordeal, was neither a simple believer nor a straightforward atheist, but something much more complex and interesting. A man whose faith had been tested by doubt and refined by suffering. This complex relationship between faith, doubt, and suffering is dramatized most powerfully through his greatest characters. Ivan Karamazov represents the most sophisticated case for atheism ever presented in literature, rejecting the divine not on scientific grounds but on moral ones, unable to accept a universe in which innocent children suffer while the divine remains silent. His rebellion cannot be overcome through theological sophistication because it is based on a fundamental moral judgment about the nature of reality itself. Yet Dostoevsky shows us that Ivan's atheism leads inevitably to moral relativism and nihilistic despair, undermining the very moral foundations that would make his fight against injustice meaningful. Against Ivan stands his brother Alyosha, who chooses to trust in divine goodness despite evidence that seems to contradict it. And this choice transforms his entire relationship to existence, freeing him to respond with spontaneous love and compassion rather than intellectual paralysis. The philosophy of redemptive suffering is embodied most clearly in characters like Sonia Marmeladova, who maintains her spiritual purity despite degraded circumstances, and Father Zosima, who teaches that all human beings are responsible for the suffering of others, and that true spiritual development requires accepting this responsibility. Sonia's suffering has not made her bitter, but has deepened her capacity for love and forgiveness, allowing her to see the divine image even in a murderer like Raskolnikov. Zosima demonstrates how suffering can be transformed into spiritual wisdom, arguing that those who achieve spiritual maturity through suffering become channels through which divine grace can enter the world. But Dostoevsky also shows that suffering can be destructive rather than redemptive, depending on how it is received. The underground man's pain has made him spiteful. Ivan's intellectual anguish has led to rebellion against the divine. Smerdyakov's abuse has turned him into a murderer. The difference lies not in the amount of pain experienced, but in the spiritual attitude with which that pain is received. Redemptive suffering requires what Dostoevsky calls active love, the willingness to bear not only one's own pain but the pain of others as well. This is not mere sympathy, but a practical commitment to sharing others' burdens, even when doing so increases one's own suffering. Such love can only emerge from those who have learned to accept their own suffering without resentment, transforming their pain into wisdom and compassion. The eternal struggle between faith and doubt, combined with the transformative potential of suffering, leads to Dostoevsky's prophetic understanding of humanity's future. Writing decades before the rise of totalitarian movements, he predicted with astonishing accuracy how revolutionary ideologies would evolve into systems of mass oppression and psychological control. The Grand Inquisitor's vision of a society based on bread, miracle, and authority perfectly anticipated the appeal of fascist and communist regimes that would seduce millions with promises of security and relief from the burden of freedom. His novels demonstrated how intellectual sophistication and humanitarian ideals could be corrupted into justifications for terrorism and mass murder, showing that the greatest evils would come from educated idealists who believed they were serving humanity. These political prophecies remain essential for understanding contemporary threats to human freedom and dignity. But Dostoevsky's psychological insights have proven equally prophetic and enduring. His exploration of the unconscious mind, the divided self, and the complex motivations that drive human behavior anticipated major psychological discoveries by decades. His understanding of how excessive self-consciousness can paralyze effective action perfectly describes the condition of millions of modern people who know what they should do but cannot bring themselves to do it. His analysis of how childhood trauma, social alienation, and spiritual emptiness create psychological disorders remains more penetrating than most contemporary theories. Most importantly, his insight that psychological healing requires spiritual transformation rather than merely technical intervention offers hope for those whom secular psychology has failed to help. Oh, the spiritual dimensions of Dostoevsky's work have become even more relevant as modern secular culture has failed to provide the meaning and transcendent significance that human beings need. His prediction that the loss of religious faith would lead to nihilism and moral relativism has been confirmed by societies that have attempted to build purely secular forms of meaning. His understanding that human beings cannot live without transcendent purpose helps explain why secular ideologies so often function as substitute religions, complete with sacred texts and demands for absolute loyalty. His vision of faith as an existential choice, rather than an intellectual conclusion, provides a way of maintaining religious commitment even in the face of modern criticism and scientific skepticism. Faith for Dostoevsky is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to trust in ultimate meaning despite evidence that seems to contradict it. Perhaps most importantly, Dostoevsky's legacy lies in his unflinching honesty about the complexity and difficulty of human existence, combined with his ultimate hope for human transformation. He refused to offer easy solutions or comfortable reassurances, acknowledging the strongest arguments against his own positions through characters as intelligent and sympathetic as those who represent his preferred alternatives. He recognized that the choice between faith and doubt, freedom and security, love and power cannot be resolved through rational argument alone, but requires fundamental decisions about how to interpret life's ambiguous evidence. This intellectual honesty makes his ultimate affirmations more meaningful because they emerge from genuine struggle with doubt and despair, rather than naive optimism. The final message of Dostoevsky's philosophical legacy is both challenging and encouraging. Challenging because it demands that we abandon comfortable illusions about human nature and face existence's full complexity. Challenging because it requires taking responsibility for our choices without the security of absolute certainty about what is right. Challenging because it calls us to love when love is not returned, forgive when forgiveness is not deserved, and hope when hope seems impossible. But encouraging because it demonstrates that humans can rise above their limitations to achieve consciousness and moral development that justify existence's suffering and struggle. Encouraging because it shows that even the darkest circumstances cannot completely extinguish human dignity and the possibility of redemption. Encouraging because it proves that love, truth, and spiritual reality are stronger than hatred, deception, and material force, even when their victory is not immediately visible. His legacy challenges us to face reality without illusion while maintaining hope without naivety, to love without conditions while accepting responsibility without excuses, to choose freedom while bearing its full weight and cost. This is perhaps the most difficult path humans can walk, but it is also the only path that leads to genuine fulfillment and authentic meaning. Those who choose this path join a communion of souls that transcends time and circumstance, united by their commitment to truth, love, and the endless struggle to become more fully human. This is Dostoevsky's ultimate gift. Not a philosophical system or easy answers, but a vision of what we can become when we choose to live with courage, honesty, and love in the face of life's eternal mysteries.